We're going to be looking at the new set of 10 lessons that we've developed for Regimental Highland broadsword, which is level 1 of the Cateran Society's curriculum. The previous core curriculum set of lessons that we were using has worked well for us for a few years now. The reason that we're making the change to this set of 10 lessons is that the previous set contained a number of examples of enclosing command techniques. But in real bouting, enclosing command is not always the smart tactical option. There's specific circumstances where it makes sense to do it, and most of the time it doesn't make sense to do it. And over time we found that students practicing those lessons would try to command far more often than the tactical situation really called for. And I think that was because of the influence of seeing so many commands in the lessons. So we've decided to reorganize, and from now on these sets of 10 lessons will actually follow a logical progression from the most basic techniques that you would use all the time to more sophisticated techniques that you would use less often. And in each case of the 10 lessons, the lesson will introduce a new concept. So concepts are not going to repeat or go in a random order like they did in the previous set of lessons. Lesson 1 is going to address fighting from the hanging guard. When you first start learning Highland broadsword fencing, one of the easiest things you can do as you start to bout is to just rely on the hanging guard, parry, and riposte, and not worry about anything more complicated than that until you've gained more experience. And even as you gain experience in broadsword fencing, there's a lot of situations where you might want to fall back on that strategy. Hanging guard, parry, riposte. You can use the hanging guard to defend against pretty much any attack the opponent can throw, because the inside half hangers and the St. George's guard are basically just parries from the hanging guard. So there's a lot of different ways that we could demonstrate that fact, but lesson 1 just shows you a basic example of attacking to the head and attacking to the side. So the format of this lesson is a head attack, followed by a head attack, followed by a cut to the inside low, and a cut to the inside low. So we both take a hanging guard. I attack the head, I defend the head, I cut inside low, I defend inside low. And we go back to the hanging guard. 7, 7, 5, 5, 7, 7, 5, 5, 7, 7, 5, 5. That was more of a 2 what he did there, but the specific line that you come in on is not crucial. It's attacking the inside low is what's crucial. You want to make that attack a little bit lower. 7, 7, 5, 5. Now, the neat thing about this lesson is that if you want to, you can loop it. So after I parry that last 5, I'm going to go straight into a cut 7, and we'll actually just keep repeating the lesson on a loop. 7, 7, 5, 5, 7, 7, 5, 5, 7, 7, 5, 5, 7, 7, 5, 5. And that's lesson number 1. Lesson 2 illustrates a principle that is important in Highland broadsword and in all of the British Isles broadsword and backsword traditions. We call this principle strike and fly out. That actual phrase, I think, comes from silver, but you'll find variations on it expressed throughout the broadsword and backsword traditions. So the idea of strike and fly out is that whenever you attack the opponent, regardless of whether you have hit the opponent or not, you get back out of there immediately under a guard, just in case. To illustrate that, we're going to start on an outside guard, and we're going to use a pattern of 1, 2, 3, 4, which is The protagonist cuts inside, defends outside, cuts inside low, defends outside low. And this illustrates that every time that the protagonist makes an attack, that has to be followed immediately by getting back out of distance with a defense. One, two, three, four. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inside, outside. Inside low, outside low. Inside, outside, inside low, outside low. This lesson can also be done as a continuous loop. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you can practice it either way, as a standalone sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can loop it for however long you and your training partner can both do it. And always remember that what we're illustrating and practicing here is the idea that your default approach in broadsword should be to attack and get out under cover immediately. There are exceptions, but that is the default approach. Lesson 3 should be familiar to anyone that's practiced our Highland broadsword lessons before, although it was in a different place in the curriculum. This is the slip. Now, a slip in the broadsword traditions means any movement that dodges the opponent's attack instead of parrying it. So a slip is any footwork motion or even a motion of your hand that avoids the opponent's attack. Sometimes this results in a simultaneous counterattack. Sometimes you do something else instead. What we're going to look at is the most basic and important slip, which is the shift and counter. We're both going to be on the hanging guard. The opponent is going to attack my leg. I will shift my lead foot back as far as or further than my rear foot, and I will simultaneously counter to the head or arm. So he attacks my leg, I shift and counter to his head. This is such an important tactic for us because it's a huge timing advantage. It takes 1 unit of fencing time, which means 1 movement, for him to cut my leg. But it only takes 1 movement for me to slip. So in that same unit of time, I can countercut. That gives me a timing advantage he can't make up, and he gets through. There are numerous other counterattacks that I could use against his arm, other than just coming straight down the middle. But that's the simplest way to start. Lesson 4, we're going to look at double attacks. This is an exception to the strike and fly out principle. This is when you launch 2 attacks in a row. So the idea when you're doing a double attack is that the first attack should create the opening to make a second attack relatively safely, where your second attack has opposition against his riposte. Opposition meaning if he was to try to make a riposte after his parry, my second attack protects me from his riposte. That makes it safer for me to try to launch that second attack. What we're going to do is we're going to be on the hanging guard. I'm going to make cut 1, and he's going to parry with an inside half hanger, or what's called a prime hanging guard, which is just a high inside half hanger. Because of the action of his parry, which is going to move his arm over here, that creates an opening to his arm on the outside. So I will follow up by traversing off the line and throwing in a cut 4 against his arm. Even if he reposts, the form of my cut 4 should create opposition against his attempted repost. So it's relatively safe. In terms of making this technique work in bouting, however, it won't work unless your second attack comes in twice as fast as your first attack, because otherwise he can simply parry it. So I cut 1. His parry creates an opening to his arm. I traverse off line and cut him under the arm. But in practice, that second attack has to come in very fast, because otherwise he will just parry. We're going to illustrate that next. He's going to parry both hits. That's not difficult for him to do. So I need to make that second attack twice as fast as the first. By making that second attack twice as fast and with a nice large traverse off line, I can get the opening I want. Now if he tries to riposte after his first parry, my second attack should provide opposition. His riposte from here is going to come to my outside. So not only do I have the cut I want to his arm, but I'm physically blocking him from getting through and hitting me at the same time. And even if I don't manage to get the cut, I still have the parry. Now we're going to look at combination attacks that go beyond just 2 attacks. This can be 3 attacks in a row, or even as many as 4, although the more attacks in a row you do, the riskier it gets. So this particular combination is going to be an attack to the wrist from below, then an attack to the outside high, and then as I get out of there, I will cut his wrist, either with a cut 3 or a cut 1. It doesn't really matter which. So it's wrist, face, and then wrist as you get out of there. Wrist, face, wrist. So this is your sequence of actions, should be just 2 lines. Okay. Wrist, face, wrist. And it's important that that third attack comes in on some kind of retreat. I like to do it as a deep shift back. In level 2, we'll be doing that as a back traverse that actually crosses the legs. But in level 1, it's easier to just do it as a deep shift back. That's the basic version. 3, 2, wrist. The idea is that the first 2 attacks set up for the third attack. Wrist, face, wrist. Now you might note that he's not shifting back on his parries. The reason for that is that extended combinations like this are really for use against opponents that are fighting in one spot and are not really using that constant shifting that we like to use in our style. Wrist, face, wrist. If you want to try the more advanced version, it would look like this. Wrist, face, wrist. There's no reason you can't use that footwork in level 1, but it is really more of what we call old style footwork, and it takes a little getting used to. Again, that looks like wrist, face, wrist. But the basic version is simply wrist, face, wrist. Lesson 6 introduces the concept of deceiving the opponent. There's an almost endless number of different ways that you can try to deceive your opponent. The basic way is with a feint. To understand what a feint is, just remember that you have to make an attack without getting closer to the opponent, followed by a real attack where you lunge in or step in. So the reason that the first attack doesn't get you any closer to the opponent is because it's fake. It's designed to get the opponent to parry something that they don't actually need to parry since you aren't close enough to hit, and that opens them up for the real attack that comes in a moment later where you do lunge in and get to hit. So I'm going to feint a cut 2 and my front foot won't move at all. Then I'll lunge and actually hit with a cut 3. When you're practicing feints, you need to remember that you don't step on the feint. You only step on the real cut. And when you're bouting, if you see the opponent throwing what looks like a cut but their front foot isn't moving, unless they're in close distance, that's a feint and you don't need to parry it. You should probably time it cutting into it. Feint, cut. And I can make that same cut to his body if I prefer. It's just a deeper target, so it's a little risky. Feint, cut. Now, to make a feint work, you have to really sell it. He's not going to fall for the feint if it looks anemic. It has to really look violent. So in a real bout, the speed of the feint would be more like this. Because you really need him to believe that he has to defend himself. In practice, this would be accompanied with an appel if you were on a surface loud enough for it to make a difference, like a floor in a fencing room. The appel is a stomp of the front foot. It just helps sell the feint. When you're outside, it doesn't do as much good, but this is what it would look like. It also fools the opponent because even though you're actually just stomping in place, the movement of the front foot looks like you might be lunging. Therefore, it's harder for the opponent to tell that you're actually just making a feint. Lesson 7 looks at timing cuts. Timing cuts are one of the most important basic tactics in Highland broadsword. So, timing is when you attack the opponent whenever the opponent changes anything. So let's say the opponent's on an inside guard and begins to switch to an outside guard. If you suddenly cut during the change, that's a timing attack. Let's say the opponent starts to advance on you, but you suddenly attack when the opponent is stepping forward. That's a timing attack. Timing attacks, though, are often used as counterattacks, and that's what we're going to look at in this lesson. We're going to be on an outside guard. My opponent will make a cut 1, and as the opponent is cutting, I will countercut to the wrist. The action of attacking leaves the opponent open during the attack as long as I spot my moment and seize it immediately. That's why it's called timing, because it's all about seizing the right time. See how high my hilt is there? That is for opposition. Because timing is inherently risky. It can easily lead to a double hit. So by making that cut to his wrist as a cut 3 and getting my basket up there, even if he blasts through and tries to hit me anyway, my basket will still protect that line. That is opposition. Obviously, timing hits don't tend to be really large hits. The idea is to inflict a little slicing cut across his wrist from underneath, and then ask him if he's had enough and would like to stop the fight, which is the tradition in broadsword fencing. Lesson 8 deals with the thrust, which is not a traditional strong point of broadsword fencers. Many of the broadsword manuals don't even discuss the thrust, except to say, if you want to be good at thrusting, go learn a small sword. So, we have one lesson that deals with the thrust, and it shows 2 of the thrusts that can happen. There are essentially 3. There's thrusting from the hanging guard, there's thrusting from the outside guard, and there's thrusting from the inside guard. but you can also have low versions of the thrust from the outside guard and of the thrust from the inside guard. So what's going to happen in this lesson is we're going to start on an inside guard. My opponent is going to make what's called a cart thrust, which means a thrust from the inside guard. It's going to look a lot like our half circle guard. From the inside guard, he's going to drop his point and thrust like that. I'm going to parry that by sweeping it aside in an outside half hanger, which is our basic parry to almost all thrusts. Then I'm going to finish the fight with a thrust in second, which means a hanging guard thrust, which is the obvious, easy riposte from that parry. So we both take an inside guard. He's going to drop his point and try to thrust underneath it to get to my belly. So that outside half hanger parry, which sweeps across all the lines, it will parry almost any thrust the opponent can make. There are situations where you're not in position to do it, and you have to do something else. But generally speaking, this parry will stop all thrusts. And it allows me to come in with opposition. You see I have very strong opposition here. He basically can't come back in. And I thrust right into his body, which, wherever it lands, is going to cause him very serious problems. And one more time. Now, even though thrusting is not our specialty, you'll do a lot better with thrusting if you remember one very important rule, which is that you have to extend your arm before the lunge. Whenever you're thrusting, you need to get the weapon out in front of you and your body comes behind it. You don't ever lunge forward thrusting with your arms still bent, because that's just asking for a double. If you remember that rule, then on the occasions where you do see a good chance to thrust, you should be able to avoid a double. Lesson 9 brings in actions on the blade. There are a lot of different actions on the blade that you can do. An action on the blade is anything where you use your blade to move the opponent's blade out of the way, creating an opening that you can hit. Now, although there's a number of different actions on the blade, our lesson is just going to be an example of one of the possible actions. So you should not only practice that particular example, but the other examples as well. The example we're going to look at is called bearing. Bearing is discussed by several of the broadsword masters. Page gives quite a bit of time to it. The basic idea in bearing is that you're pushing the opponent's blade to the side to create an opening. Now, some of Page's descriptions of bearing have a sequence of events where the opponent makes an attack to your outside, you lunge in with your parry, and then bear. We're going to look at a simplified version of that so that you can just get the basic skill before you worry about applying it in that kind of situation. In this version, the two fencers start closer to each other so that you have the opportunity to just work on bearing from that position rather than needing the setup. So you get your outside guard, push your opponent's blade to the side, and then cut within the guard. That's the basic application of bearing. And you can try that in a bout any time when you're close enough to your opponent that you'll be able to reach them without having to lunge in too deep. If you press on their blade and they press back, it feels strong but flexible, you're not going to be able to succeed in getting a bearing attack. But if you press on the opponent's blade and the opponent doesn't do anything, then you'll be able to get an easy touch that way by doing what you're going to see in this lesson. So we take an outside guard and we're fairly close. I press the opponent's blade to the side. This is basically a test. I want to see if the opponent is going to push back. Since the opponent did not push back, I cut within the guard, and I'm easily going to be able to target the face or cut the throat from there. can also do that attack as a false edge cut, but false edge cuts do require more cutting skill to do effectively. It will buy you a little extra time because you don't have to turn your blade. So it would look like this. You can rake that right across his eyes, but don't do that without a pencil. Now, it might seem like, okay, bearing works in the outside guard, why don't I try it in the other guards? You can bear somewhat on the inside guard, but the results don't tend to be as good. And you definitely should not try bearing on the hanging guard, because this is what happens. When the hanging guard, Matt tries to bear on my blade, I just let his push to the side give me the momentum to come right over the top. So never ever bear against the hanging guard. You can do it against the inside guard if the opponent's inside guard seems weak. You can definitely do it against a medium guard. And the outside guard is really, what it's designed for. In Lesson 10, we're finally going to look at Enclosing command, which occupied a much larger place in the previous set of 10 lessons. Now, all of those techniques that were in the earlier set of 10 lessons are still available to you. They're still part of the Cateran system, and you can and should still practice them. What we're giving here in this lesson is just an example of the range of command techniques you can use. So all of the techniques that we call commands involve seizing the opponent's weapon or weapon arm. And it follows a simple sequence that we refer to as contact, control, kill. You won't find that phrase in the manuals. It's just a mnemonic that describes a range of techniques that you find in the manuals. So contact, your blades make contact with each other. Control, you use your offhand to get control of the opponent's weapon arm. Kill doesn't necessarily mean you kill the opponent. It means you finish the fight. So you can compel the opponent to surrender if you're trying to avoid killing them. We only say contact, control, kill because it's easier to remember as a phrase than saying contact, control, and then do something to finish the fight, which isn't such a great mnemonic. So, the control phase, what's crucial to understand is that you have to break the opponent's center line. So you make contact, which is your sword parry. The control phase, your offhand does one of several things that cause the opponent's center line to either get twisted or pushed backwards or pushed forwards. And those all disrupt the opponent's structural integrity so they can't do anything to defend themselves, and then you finish them off, and that's the kill. All right? So the example that we're going to look at right now is a prime hanging parry, which turns into a whirl, which is actually an action on the blade. It brings the opponent over that way, and you grab their sword arm and push them that way. When you do that, their whole body's going to twist up like that. That's the center line being broken, in this case by twisting. And then you finish them off with a big decapitating cut, or you indicate that you could do that if you wanted to, and you spare them. So we're in the hanging guard. My opponent cuts my inside high. I step in on the parry. You need to do this with all commands. You won't be close enough to do it if you don't step in on the parry. I whirl the opponent over this way. There's the command. I'm grabbing the opponent's weapon arm. Watch how I push him offline as I pass forward with my left foot, bring my sword around, and I can strike him in the head or in the neck, which is better because they won't get the resistance from the skull. Or I can just stick my tip in the opponent's face and suggest to him that he probably doesn't want to keep going. Now we call that technique where we push the opponent's arm off to the side a bind. Again, that's not a technique you'll find in the manuals. There are several techniques that end that way in the manuals, and for convenience's sake we needed a term that described them all, and so we call that a bind. The reason we selected this one for the lesson, even though it's only an example and in fact all the other commands are equally valid, is that the bind seems to happen more often than any other when you're actually bouting. And you see how twisted up his center line is. Makes it difficult for him to do anything to try to escape or try to fight back. If I really get my timing right, I can also kick his heel out from under him. Now, I said at the beginning of this sequence of lessons that people tend to overuse commands. I'm going to finish up by illustrating when you should try a command and when you shouldn't try a command. Commands can only be done from half-sword distance, which means in our system that your blades are crossed halfway up. It's literally impossible to do the command in any other circumstance and expect to get away with it. So, here's an example of where it would work. He attacks my inside. I step in on it. That gets us to where our blades are crossed halfway up or more, I should have said. So where our blades are obviously crossed much further down than halfway. Now, I can hook my pommel over his, bind him, pass forward, and get my tip in his face. That's called the Turkish disarm. And you'll see that again in the lessons from level 2. Or, we're in an outside guard. Again, he cuts to my inside. I step in, parry. Our blades are crossed more than halfway up. That means there's a good chance for a command. I snake my arm in under his, lock his elbow, make him surrender. That's the elbow lock. Lonergan describes this in his manual, and he has you start punching the guy in the face with your basket when you have him elbow locked. Or, we're in the hanging guard. He comes in to attack my head. I step in and parry St. George. I lift his arm up. Watch how that's distorting his center line backwards. I step in, and again I could apply the pommel, or I could threaten to thrust into his face or his body. Or, we're in the inside guard. He goes to cut to my outside. I step in on the parry. Again, we're crossed more than halfway up. I grab his wrist. You see again how his center line is distorted, this time forward, and I have the tip in his face. And I can kick his heel up if I want to and if I'm in the right spot for it. So in all these circumstances, I stepped in on the parry and got to the half-sword distance. What I see people doing when they try a command and it doesn't work is that they try to force it in a situation where it's not tactically appropriate, where they're not at half-sword distance. So for example, we're fencing back and forth and I get a parry out here, or even here, anything where, see, our blades are not crossed halfway up. Watch what happens if I try to go in now for a Turkish disarm. I walk right into it, and it's very easy for him to do that because I'm trying to cross too large a distance. It's the equivalent of trying to charge across a large field straight into enemy fire. It's too far a distance, there's too much going against you, and you're never going to make it. Just because every once in a long while you pull it off by going in so quick does not mean it's tactically valid. Tactically valid techniques are techniques that you can count on working, not techniques that work once in a blue moon. So again, say we're in the inside guard and I get a parry out here, I do not have an opportunity to run forward and grab his wrist and yank him forward. If I try it, he decided to be nice and just cut my leg out from under me. He had a much more lethal option there, which was to thrust to my body as I run in. And that's it, I'm dead. So, you never try commands unless you're at half-sword distance. And even then, you don't want to try them constantly. You need to do them when you can be pretty sure you're going to pull them off, and then you need to absolutely commit and go in with the intention that you're going to definitely get that command right now. If you try it half-heartedly, it won't work. If you do it slowly, it won't work. If you think to yourself, I'll see if I can make it work, it won't work. And especially if you do it from out of distance, it won't work. You have to be at half-sword distance, and you have to go in with total commitment when you decide to do it. Because of that, you can bout all day long and not see a single command. or you can bout and see one command after another if the opponent is giving you the opportunities that you need to get the command. So it all depends on the situation, and you should never feel like, oh, I'm not trying commands often enough, I should really be trying more commands, which is something I see students telling me a lot in the online program. You shouldn't be trying commands constantly. You should only try them when there is an actual opportunity for the command. So that is our new set of 10 lessons. I do want you to practice them all. I don't want you to be married to them. What I mean by that is I don't want you to just practice that set of 10 and then think you've covered all the concepts. Each of those lessons is an example, and it's meant to introduce a concept. There's numerous other examples. They will all be laid out in writing for you. Each of those lessons essentially represents a chapter, and the way I actually want you to practice those lessons is to practice all of the different examples. So, for example, in lesson 10, which is Enclosing command, don't just practice that bind from the prime hanging whirl. What I want you to practice is all of the commands that are listed in that chapter. So there's the bind, there's the lock, there's the lift, there's the grip. You'll see all of those in the written material that we have. And I want you to actually practice them all, and whenever you practice lesson 10, think of lesson 10 as meaning all the examples of enclosing command, not just that one. That one is just an example to show us how you're doing and that you understand and can apply the concept. Because of that, when you're submitting training videos or when you're teaching students in your own study groups, you don't have to use the example we've given as the basic example. You can actually pick any of the other ones if you prefer to work with one of the other ones. So if you want to submit Turkish disarm or elbow lock to me as an example of lesson 10, that's just as valid as the official one. And that's true out of all of the lessons. You can submit any of the examples from, you can submit any of the lessons from the chapter and not just the official example. And when you're teaching it to students, you can select any of the examples from the chapter as the one you want to concentrate on. It doesn't have to be the official one. In the end, though, you should practice and familiarize yourself with all of them.